Hello, and thank you for joining our webinar today. My name is Daniel Alexander Head, and I'm the Director of Innovation here at Potentiate. In a world where our minds can now really only cater for 6-second cat memes, the ability to get a message across succinctly and grab the attention it needs is harder than ever. When telling a narrative from data, this can be even tougher. Visualization of data allows us to communicate to a broader audience than numbers by themselves. But perhaps what is hardest is not what to show, but what not to show. Today, our Chief Research Officer, Ray Pointer, is going to share with you a highly effective approach for data visualization. Contrary to the title of the webinar, Dancing with Data, it is unlikely that Ray will be showing you any of his disco moves, though for the right price they can be shared. Rather, Ray will be talking about visualization through an approach we call MEME. Monitor, explore, measure, explain. So, without further ado, it's my pleasure to introduce Ray.
Hi, Ray Pointer here, and I'm going to take you through MEME, which are the 4 pillars of data visualization. But first, I'm going to start with the inspiration for this project, and that inspiration comes from a guy called Hans Rosling, the late Hans Rosling. And he was a Swedish doctor, academic, and a regular presenter at TED. He showed that you can make data much more interesting and much easier to understand. MEME, the 4 pillars of data visualization. The sort of visualization you need to produce is different for different purposes and for different audiences. And we end up with quite different visualizations for each of these 4 purposes. And I'm going to go through the 4 purposes in turn, starting with M for monitor. And the car dashboard is such a good metaphor for what a monitor should look like. And it shows us why so many existing dashboards for insights and data sets are so ineffective. The first thing we see about the car dashboard is a really big speedo. And that is for a reason. We need to know the speed we're traveling at. The second thing that is really relevant to the speed is that we can adjust the speed in real time. We're driving along, we have the brake, we have a handbrake, we have gears, we have how much we're pushing the accelerator down. When we're looking at a dashboard, we're often thinking about, can somebody make a decision based on what they're seeing on the dashboard? And how important is that decision? If it's really important and they need to be making the decision all the time, then it should be like the speedo. It should be really prominent. There are other things on the dashboard which are reactive in their nature. So I only want to see the oil warning light if there is an oil problem. I don't want a green oil light saying oil is fine. What do people need to see all the time? What do they need to see in order to be reactive so that they can respond to something? Active monitoring, you need to be seeing this all the time, and you have a lever. You have some method of responding to it. That tells us that it should be there all the time and it should be prominent. Reactive monitoring is one of those cases where less is more. When things are okay, you want an absence of signal, so the appearance of the signal becomes part of the messaging. We also need to think about how we're going to blend status with trends. And at the moment, because of the world pandemic, some of the best visualizations that are out there in the public domain are looking at issues around COVID and coronavirus. And this one is from The Guardian in the UK. It shows us various things. So there is a status, 52.4% fully vaccinated. We have daily cases, which shows us on the left a trend line. It shows the current status and it shows the change from last week. We know that people who are watching these monitors have different things that they're interested in. We have to make a single configuration for most people. This one blends the status with the trend in a way that's very straightforward and is informative. So to summarize monitoring, you've got to decide who is the user and what are their needs. You're designing things for the user and their needs. The little pieces that we put into a dashboard when we're doing monitoring are typically called widgets. So adjust the widgets so the ones the user needs to focus on are more prominent. They are probably going to be bigger. They are probably going to have more detail in them. Don't just base it on how much data there is, because sometimes in a dashboard you see the bigger widgets are bigger because there is more data, not because they're more relevant or more important. If a visualization supports reactive decisions like your oil warning light, don't set its default to be always visible. If it's about reactive decision making, only show it when it's necessary. What there tends to be quite often on a dashboard is it's red if you need to take action, and it's green if it's okay, and it's amber if you need to be slightly aware of it. That is less helpful to most users than just showing it when they need to be aware of it. And determine whether the user wants to see the current status of variables or trends, or quite often both. So that's the M from meme. Now let's come to the first E, exploring. We want to enable search and investigation. So this allows for a much wider range of looking at the data than we get for monitoring. With monitoring, we know approximately why people are monitoring the data. We know what the tasks are. It's much more open-ended with search and investigation and explore. Sometimes that might be possible with a dashboard. So quite often you'll create a dashboard and people will be able to explore the data. I'm going to show you an example in a moment using a dashboard from the Financial Times, and again looking at COVID type data. But beyond that, you might need a data access system, and people are using Excel, people are using SPSS, people are using a wide range of tools, and one of my colleagues, Dan, is going to tell you about one that we've got later on to go beyond just dashboards. So let's start with dashboards, and I'm going to show you how I might use a dashboard to explore some of the information about countries. And in this video, I'm going to look at how we use visualization to enable us to do a search as part of Explore. So we have a question and we want to answer it, and we're trying to use a dashboard. So the dashboard I'm going to use for my example is the Financial Times Corona Tracker. And I'm going to answer the question, or try to answer the question, how well is the United Kingdom doing in terms of the coronavirus and its response to it? And for that, I'm going to go down through this dashboard and I'm going to highlight a particular widget here, which is explore how the country data. So I'm going to go to this particular configuration. And one of the things about dashboards is that they have a set of pre-configured views of the data, and they need to make sure that they give you a sufficient set of views for you to be able to search for your answer. So this default comes up and it shows the United Kingdom and it shows the United States. And I look at this and I say, okay, well, that's not the right period of time for me. So I'm going to change the period of time up here, and I'm going to change it all the way back to January last year in 2020. 01, 2020. And now we have a very different picture, and we can see that there is a bit of a hiccup in the data. So in fact, it probably makes sense for us to go back to March last year. So we'll change this to be 03, 01, 2020. We've then got to decide what numbers do we want to look at. Do we want to look at cases or do we want to look at deaths? Well, actually, in terms of how well has a country tackled the coronavirus, I think it makes much more sense to look at deaths. We can look at the cumulative picture, which is actually remarkably similar in terms of the other items on this page. But let's look at those other items first. Per 100,000 population, well, that makes sense because the population of the United States is much bigger than the UK. If I were to look at raw numbers, the United States, of course, looks much worse. This is also a logarithmic scale, and when I'm trying to understand what's happening, that's not very helpful for comparing one country with another. So let's look at it in linear scale. And what we have now are the deaths, but it's cumulative. So that is interesting, but it's not what I'm going to look at first of all. I'm going to look at the picture at the moment and the picture over time. And what we can see there is that the United Kingdom is much worse twice than the United States. The United States has got a narrower range over time. But what about the range of countries I want to compare it with? Well, I should probably compare the United Kingdom with its immediate neighbours. So let's put in Germany and let's put in France. And I'm going to compare it with a country that I know has done very well. So I'm going to compare it with Australia. Now, if we look at this picture, we can see that the patterns are quite different over time. Here we get the United States was much worse than any of the other countries during July or September. So at any moment in time over the past year and a half, this is going to give me some sort of idea about who is doing better and who is not doing as well. And it actually shows me that right now there isn't a lot of difference between these countries. There was during the period of time. So let's have a look at it now cumulatively. And if we look at it cumulatively, we now have a fairly clear answer to who has done well. Australia has done well. So now we've looked at the data, we've got something that's fairly easy to envisage because it's not a logarithmic scale. It is based on deaths. It's deaths per 100,000. And I've picked a set of comparative countries. So this is how we might use visualization tools to help us search for the answer to a specific question. But sometimes we need more than a dashboard. This is usually when we can't envisage exactly the sorts of questions people are going to be asking, so we can't create widgets in advance with a range of tools that are going to allow people to do that exploring. So I'm going to show you now another example, and this time I'm going to use a site called Gapminder. Gapminder was created by Hans Rosling, the person I mentioned earlier, and it uses his style of accessing data and looking at information. So let's look at how we use data to explore an idea or to explain an idea. So I'm going to pick the relationship between CO2, pollution, global warming, and population size and politics. How does Australia compare with UK, compared with China? So I've just logged into Gapminder, and this is the page that was set up when I arrived here. It's got income along the bottom, which is per person. So it's the GDP per capita, inflation adjusted in international currency scales. And on the left hand side, we've got life expectancy, which is not relevant to what I'm looking at. So I'm going to go and have a look and see what other scales I could use. I could look at babies per woman, child mortality, population, but I'm going to take CO2 emissions per person. And one of the things I'm going to do is think about how far back in time we can look with this data. And we can certainly go back to about 1900. That's not a bad starting point, is it? And if we look at 1900, we see there's a very clear relationship between income and CO2 emissions. Right at the top we have the United Kingdom. It's got the highest income, it's got the highest CO2. Then the United States, highest income per person, highest CO2 emissions per person. Come down in the middle and we've got the Meiji era, because Japan is moving forward. It's been recently industrializing and it has got lower income than those leading countries, but much higher than the rest of the world. And it's got the sort of CO2 emissions. If we go right down the right hand side, India, very poor, very few emissions. Behind that, China, very poor, very few emissions. So let's just move the clock forward to 1914, the start of the First World War. The pattern is very similar. Okay, 1915, what we can see here is the United States at the top, United Kingdom, and to some extent the First World War and then the Second World War really broke the back of the power of the United Kingdom. We're going to see that in the data. We see Australia down here, look, tiny population. The size of the bubbles is the size of the population. Australia's red, so it's in the Asia Pacific region. The Europe region up here is Europe, and there's Germany. Plenty of population, plenty of wealth, plenty of CO2 emissions. So let's move forward, and as we move through the 20s, we start to get the economic recession, but there is still overall growth. And if we look at the United States there, look how from 28 then down to 32, it's dropped back a lot. And as the income dropped, the CO2 dropped. It's almost a measure of wealth at this sort of level. There are some countries down here, what have we got? Iraq, very little CO2 emissions to do with them exporting oil, but actually having no industry of their own. Over here, we have got Switzerland, very high level of wealth coming from banking and similar industries, very low levels of CO2. But overall, CO2 means wealth, wealth means CO2. Let's move forward now as we're running into the World War. And what we see is the United States pulling away. And as I mentioned, the United Kingdom falling away from the United States. Germany, the loser, one of the losers in the Second World War, much further down. Russia, really been hurt by the First World War, then by the Russian Revolution, then by the Second World War. So let's move that forward. And what we see now down here, this is China. This was the mistakes being made under Chairman Mao, which led to a massive falling back in the economy. Enormous numbers of people starving. So wealth dropped, emissions stayed about the same, but pretty negligible. So as we move now into the 60s, whoa, we've got a real pollution here. North Korea starting to become a real polluter as they move forward. Uzbekistan also a dirty factory for part of the Soviet Union. Ukraine, Poland, a lot of these industries coming up in what was still the Soviet Union, generating a lot of dirt. And if we have a look where Australia is, we can pick it from this list on the right hand side. Absolutely tucked away in the middle of this pack here. So let's move on forward as we move into the 80s. And we're starting to see some movement now in India and China. They're getting richer. They're not particularly getting dirtier at this point. They're certainly not as dirty as the European, Japan, Saudi Arabia, Australia, Canada, United States per person. That takes into the 90s. China and India still moving up, and in fact everybody leaving so much of Africa. Africa is blue. There are some stronger countries in Africa. So up here we've got South Africa, economy growing, pollution growing. Here we've got Egypt, the economy growing, the pollution not so much growing as we go through there. We're getting up to 2009 and we keep moving through and we get to 2018, which is as recent as the data gets. And what can we see? Nobody is a significant country and wealthy and not dirty. there is a really narrow band. The richer you get, the dirtier you get. The richer per person, the dirtier you are. China is a major polluter because the population's big, but in terms of pollution per person, it's no worse than Japan and Germany. Australia is almost the most polluting country in terms of pollution per person. Yes, there are exceptions. Up here we've got Qatar, who are head and shoulders above everybody else, but tiny. If we're going to control CO2 emissions, we clearly need to work out how to be rich and have a much lower level. So if we look at the low outliers, Singapore, relatively low level of pollution for the level of wealth they've got. They've got a lot of wealth. Norway, Switzerland, Sweden. We begin to see Denmark, so we begin to see sort of a Scandinavia sort of pattern down there. So there is a difference to be made. We can look at these countries and say, well, that's what these countries up here should be able to do. Australia should be able to be as good as these. But of course, these countries have to come all the way down here before there's a difference. And that's how we use data to explore an idea. So let's summarize what we need to create a system to enable people to explore. And what we need more than anything else is a friction-free environment. It's designed for the explorer. And that might be you, remember, when you're choosing different configurations, different systems. What do I mean by friction-free? Well, the best example is you really do not want to have to cut and paste information from your data file to your analysis to your presentations. You want to be able to move along quickly and find a story. You don't have to create presentation ready material when you're doing the explore, because the vast majority of things you look at will not be part of the presentation. You want to be able to undo actions. So when, for example, I was moving the time backwards and forwards, I was trying to find the right place to look at. I can include a country or exclude a country. So I want to be able to undo things. I want to be able to save stories, views, pictures, and I want to put labels with them. So as I'm going through the exploring, I'm creating a record that I can go back to build my presentation. I can build my story, my total story from. I want to be able to swap the axis, and this happens a lot when we're exploring the data. We might first of all see the data brands by attributes, but actually we need to see attributes by brands in order to get the visualization to work. So switching axes in the data really needs to be straightforward. You want to be able to swap the base. So if we're thinking about COVID type data, I want to look at total deaths, or I want to look at deaths per 100,000 people in the country, or as a percentage of all deaths, because the visualization I'm looking for will differ, and the questions I'm trying to answer will differ depending on the base and these sorts of issues. And I want to be able to use filters so I can look at subgroup, and I want to look at the information over time. Now let's look at manage, and manage isn't used heavily in data insights at the moment, but I think we could make much more use of it because other fields use manage quite a lot. And the first example is an IKEA visualization when we're putting furniture together. And what we're trying to do with these visualizations is help create outcomes. So what we can see in this simple diagram here is it's very simplified, very stylized, but there is amplification around particular points of detail. So not everything is to the same scale. There is a focus to it, and there is a sequence. So this is steps 3 and 4. And one of the things you will see with good visualizations for manage is they don't give you choices. There may be 2 or 3 different ways we could put the flat pack together. It would not help most people to say, well, you could do this first or you could do this one first. What people generally want is to be told one way of doing it, and that one way works. Flowcharts are another good example of a visualization for managing a process. So this is from the United Kingdom. It's from a city called Bradford in the north of England. And it's a flowchart of what to do if there's a school incident or emergency. Because people won't necessarily memorize all this information. They can look at the chart and say, right, this is what we should do first. And it's got little clues in it like letter sequences, it's got the telephone numbers they might want to use. And again, it doesn't give you a different order. It says ring this number and then ring this number. Answer this question and then you will do this if it's yes and this if it's no. So it's creating outcomes, it's simplifying the process, it's giving you a specific choice. But the best example of visualization to manage comes back to the sat-nav. And the sat-nav gives you a simplified picture of where you need to go. It will sometimes augment that with voice. It will sometimes, if you're coming up to a complex junction, augment that with video, showing you a simplified picture of what you should be able to see so you know which lane you should be in going forward. Right at the start, your sat-nav will give you some choices about which route to take. Do you want to go this way or this way? Once you've selected them, it doesn't keep asking you about choices. It tells you which way to go. But something that the sat-nav has got that the other two don't have is the ability to reroute. If something happens, like you take a wrong turning, it will now work out what is the best way to go forward. The IKEA diagram doesn't say, well, if you've made a mistake there, this is the best way of fixing it. The sat-nav will recalibrate, rethink and say, right, the way to go forward from here is this, and it will then use its visualization, its managed visualization to take you forward. So if we think about managed visualizations, simplify it, show the message, not the detail. Be unambiguous. Yes, there might be several alternatives, but only show one of them. And try to be adaptive. Take the user's needs and actions into account. So if somebody takes a wrong step, don't simply say undo it. Try to think about the best way forward from the new starting point. So if we think about this in terms of insights and research information and data, here is a typical process. We've got a debrief or report, we have the findings, and that's the bulk of the process, and then we have the recommendations. How about we rethink that process? So change the findings to the explain, and we're going to talk about explain on the next slide, and go from recommendations to visualizations that help manage, create the outcomes that the report is suggesting are the right outcomes. So our fourth letter, E, explain. And the most important thing to remember is that it's all about the audience. You may prefer a particular style of visualization, but actually you don't matter when we're talking about explain. What matters is what works for the audience. And what works for one audience will not necessarily work for another audience. So you need to understand your audience. You need to design your explain visualizations in a way that people both enjoy and understand, to go back to that phrase from Hans Rosling. So you need to know what your message is. Here is a great visualization from pudding.cool, and they want to show the issue around men having more dialogue in Disney movies. They've actually shown it in various other types of movies too. Very clear what the message is. So they've designed the visualization in a way that brings that across. So not only have they used bar charts to show the difference, but they've grouped all of the categories where men have 60% or more on the left, where there is a gender balance, and where women have more dialogue on the right. And we can see, without having to read the detail, that column of men having more dialogue is simply much, much bigger than the other two combined. That is knowing what the message is. We want truth, not precision. So too much of the visualization I see around insights data has got too much detail, too many numbers. What we want to do is use the visualization to convey the message. We want to convey the understanding of what is happening. We need to make sure that the types of visualization we use are not just attractive, but that actually work in terms of how people perceive things. So this is a classic example of the problem with a three-dimensional pie chart. If I look at that pie chart quickly, I get the impression that that golden area D is the biggest of all the sectors. In fact, it's exactly the same size in terms of the data as C, the grey area, and E, the sort of blue at the top, is 20% more data than D. So the distortion is created by the visualization. Something like this is not as attractive, but it's much easier for people to read and understand. So we need to make sure that we use visualizations that are easy to interpret and will be interpreted correctly. Narrative flow is something which crops up time and time again in storytelling. And what we've got here are some data that look at deaths per million because of COVID up to September last year, and cases per million. And that data is organized in the order I downloaded it from the website, from the Worldometer website. So it's ranked alphabetically. There is no narrative flow. But if I change it, so it's sorted by deaths per million, now we've got a narrative flow. We can see which countries at that point had the highest deaths per million, but we can also see that there's a really big difference in which countries are doing a good job about testing and identifying cases, countries like Brazil and USA, and countries that are not doing as good a job at identifying cases. So UK, Italy, Sweden, France. We've created a narrative flow. Now the visualization is much easier for me to use it when creating the explanation. Simplify is really important, and this is quite a nice example from the 538 site from Nate Silver's analysis of politics, and this is looking at what best explains Hillary Clinton's vote in the presidential election when she was standing for election against President Trump. And the data has been simplified down in several ways. First, two factors: more college, and people who've got a degree, people who have got some college, and people who have got no college. And religious attendance, people who never attend, people who sometimes attend, people who attend every week. In the United States politics, red is the country of the right-wing party of the Republicans, blue is the colour of the more left-wing party, the Democrats. So the squares are coloured in to show who gets a bigger share of the vote. The numbers are just the numbers of Hillary Clinton's vote. They're not showing Clinton and Trump because that would be double the amount of numbers. And we can look at this chart just in terms of where did Hillary Clinton's vote come from. So more college, people with a degree, Hillary Clinton tended to get 77%. Amongst people who have some college and attend church weekly, Hillary Clinton got 18%. Now, of course, this is an arbitrary selection. It's 9 regular boxes. That simplification makes it much easier to get the message across that by and large, people who attend church less often and have more education were tending to vote Hillary Clinton. People who attend church more often and who tend to have less education were much less likely to vote for Hillary Clinton. And we can see that pattern come through nice and strongly. We should also learn from history. Now, this is back in the middle of the 19th century. and it's Florence Nightingale's data from the Crimean War. And what she used this to do was to show that most of the soldiers were not dying of their injuries. The sort of the pinky colour are people who died from their wounds. The black colour is other cases, but all that big grey, bluey sort of area are people who died of diseases that could have been treated. All of those grey deaths were unnecessary deaths. She used this data to get funding and to get an improvement in the treatment of soldiers in the various fields of battle around the world. So very, very powerful. And we wouldn't use exactly the same sort of visualization today, but there are some fantastic visualizations from history. Jon Snow and the cholera outbreak in London, the advance and retreat of Napoleon's Grand Army going into Russia, the change in civilization over time. These historical explanations of data are worth looking at so that you create better things going forward. Those are the 4 pillars of data visualization. If you think about what task am I trying to do? Am I doing monitoring, exploring, manage, or explain? You will create better visualizations, because the best visualization is only the best visualization for a specific task, for a specific purpose, for a specific audience. Now I'm going to hand over to my colleague Dan, who is going to tell you a little bit about how we at Potentiate are responding to these challenges.
So we've heard from Ray how to consider using data to achieve your objectives. Everything that we develop at Potentiate is based on what our customers tell us is missing from the market. However, we also pay close attention to how our customers and partners innovate with the tools that we provide. So what have we been developing here at Potentiate? How are our customers using our solutions? And how does this relate to Meme? 2 key solutions we have built are HX1 and HX Connect. These solutions help brands monitor how they're being perceived and the experience that customers encounter. Within the brand's organization, they democratize insights and drive efficiencies, and they help to uncover insights otherwise not seen, very much in that realm of explore, which Ray just discussed, highlighting opportunities and reducing the need for further research. They also are designed to help maximize the values of the tools you already have by complementing and not replacing them. One of Australia's largest banks, Westpac, have been using our HX1 solution since 2018. At a basic level, it comprises of an insight-specific library for all prior reports and presentations, as well as interactive reporting for key business data sets such as NPS and brand tracking. What the insights team at Westpac have shared with us is that this has had a significant reduction in the amount of requests and queries they receive from within the business, as all staff have access to the platform. If you want to learn more about the success Westpac have had with HX1, go to www.potentiate.com/blog/hx-1-westpac. That's a bit of a mouthful, so you can continue to give QR codes their long-awaited time in the sun for, well, something a little bit more optimistic than what they get used for the majority of the time. In the coming months, our next-gen version of HX1 is going to be released, and this has been built with record-breaking data crunching speeds and machine learning-based search functionality, so you can combine data from almost anywhere in the organization to uncover what's really going on, what's happening with the customer. And as always, this is complemented by our services with a solution model. Those of you who work with us already will know what this is, but this is designed so you're not left to your own devices trying to work out how to get value from the platform you've just invested in. We think the new HX1 is groundbreaking, and we can't wait to share more about it in the coming weeks and months. But if you simply can't wait to hear more about HX1 and how Meme can support your business, do get in touch with us today. Thank you so much for joining us for today's webinar. We really appreciate you taking the time from your day to hear from us. And now we'd love to hear from you with any questions that you may have.